Today is March 8th, International Women's Day. What a lot of people don't know, though, is that this used to be called International Working Women's Day, and this day was launched by revolutionary communists way back in 1910. They launched this day to unite the fight for women's liberation with the fight for communism because the two are inseparable. You cannot achieve one without the other. Unfortunately, this day has been co-opted by feminists, and this rich history has been totally erased. So, some background to the launching of International Working Women's Day. Back in those days, there were two movements for fighting for women's equality. One for the property-owning women, led by feminists, and another for working women, led by the communists. Now, the feminists claim to represent all women, not just rich women. However, whenever the struggle of working women to improve their conditions undermined the rule of the rich and powerful, the feminists opposed them. One example is when German socialists tried to unionize domestic servants. Now, at this time, in all the big European towns, most employed women were working as domestic servants. When these women fought for shorter hours, higher pay, and maternity leave, the feminists opposed this. And this makes complete sense because the domestic servants were poor women working for rich women as their servants. In 1891, a bill was passed in Massachusetts to limit the working day for working women to 12 hours a day. Now, 12 hours is a very long workday still, but feminists opposed this bill on the basis that it goes against the principle of gender equality. Women should have the freedom to work as many hours as they want and be exploited as hard as they like. Some years later, in 1908 in Russia, feminists held their first all-Russian Women's Congress and brought together 1,000 delegates from across the country. Socialist women attended this and put forward resolutions in favor of the protection of women workers, for maternity leave, for childcare. All of these resolutions were rejected by this feminist conference, once again on the basis that they undermined the fight for gender equality. So why is this? Why did the feminists attack every attempt by working women to improve their conditions? The answer is simple. It is because the property-owning women and the working women had diametrically opposing class interests, even though they were all oppressed as women. The women of the ruling class were completely fine living under capitalism. They just wanted as much power and wealth as the men of their class, an equal right to exploit the working class. So they mainly fought for equal property rights with their husbands, brothers, and fathers, which included the right to vote regardless of gender, as long as you own property. The bourgeois women wanted to maintain capitalism, but they wanted to expand their own privileges within it. The feminists claimed to represent all women, but really they just represented themselves. Now, the women who worked as domestic servants or factory workers or poor housewives would not need any property rights. It made no difference for them because they had no property, and neither did any men in their families. Like all workers, these working women needed higher pay, shorter hours, and longer holidays. And as working women, they specifically needed things like maternity leave and childcare centers. And these reforms could be won only through a class struggle, only through a fight against the entire capitalist class, which inevitably brought them into conflict with the capitalist women. And the most reliable comrades in this fight for working women were the working men, the men of their own class. It would take the involvement of as wide a layer of workers as possible in this fight to hit the bosses where it really hurts and win reforms. And ultimately to overthrow the capitalist system. Because any reforms that are won under this system can only be partial and temporary. They will eventually be taken back. Only through a communist revolution, which places power in the hands of working women and men and lets them forge their own destinies, can we achieve real liberation. So that's the background in which the communists launched International Working Women's Day. So in August of 1910, the socialists organized their second ever international conference of socialist women. Over 100 delegates attended from 17 countries, and it is here that International Working Women's Day was born. The resolution for it was put forward by Clara Zetkin, a revolutionary communist who would go on to help found the German Communist Party. And the resolution called for a Women's Day every year and in every country, as a struggle for getting working women the vote. This was to be a day of international solidarity for common objectives and a day for reviewing the organized strength of working women under the banner of socialism. Zetkin's proposal was approved unanimously and enthusiastically by all of the delegates in attendance. And the slogan was decided to be the following: The vote for women will unite our strength in the struggle for socialism. The first International Working Women's Day was held on March 8th, 1911. It was only organized in a few countries, but it was massively successful. Over 1 million women came out and demanded the right to vote, to work, and to hold public office. In following years, socialist women in more countries would organize their own International Working Women's Day on March 8th. So yeah, International Women's Day as we know it today was launched by communists, and it explicitly called for a struggle for socialism. Now, technically speaking, there was one Women's Day before all of this, which did inspire Zetkin partially. The first ever Women's Day was organized by socialists in North America on February 28th in 1909, but it was also organized by revolutionaries. So the point still stands that this day has revolutionary communist traditions. From 1911 to 1913, International Working Women's Day continued to spread to more and more countries and grow in strength. This was also a period of the class struggle heightening, but unfortunately this process was cut across with the declaration of World War I in 1914. For 3 years, the Great War dragged humanity through the worst barbarism and bloodshed it had ever seen, and with no end in sight. Russia was one of the worst hit countries, with some estimates having over 1 million dead. There was also terrible inflation and food shortages. Russian women were seeing their husbands, sons, and brothers brought back in coffins and waiting in long bread lines to feed their families. By the start of 1917, they were reaching their limit. Now, for the duration of World War I, Women's Day was not really being organized, but the women of Petrograd decided that they were going to go out and rally and strike for Women's Day on March 8th. They went to all the revolutionary organizations and stated their aims, but they were told that's too dangerous, you can't do that. Even the Bolsheviks, but they did it anyway. They didn't realize it at the time, but their bravery would spark the February Revolution. So on March 8th, 1917, women textile workers in Petrograd would go out onto the streets to demand peace and bread. A large crowd of women ended up converging and demanding bread and peace and bread. Our children are starving. As they marched through the streets, they threw sticks and snowballs at the factories and invited the men working inside to come out and join them. It ends up growing to 75,000 people, and they're calling for an end to the war. Now, despite the fears of the revolutionaries that this demonstration would be really dangerous, nothing bad actually happened to the demonstrators. The next day, they all went back to their factories, but they didn't go there to work. Instead, they organized meetings and walkouts. Half of Petrograd went on strike, and they were all demanding, down with the war, down with the Tsar. Less than 1 week after International Working Women's Day in 1917, the Tsar was overthrown. The February Revolution spread throughout Russia and its empire as a tsunami of Soviets. Organs of bottom-up workers' power, embryos of the future workers' state mushroomed everywhere. Now, the February Revolution did not end Russia's participation in the war because Russia was still a capitalist country. But it did open up a revolutionary period which would culminate in the communists taking power in October, declaring a workers' government, and ending Russia's involvement in the war. As a workers' government, as the first worker state in world history, the Soviet Union was able to provide women with equal political rights as men before any other country. They also made divorce really easy. It was easier to get a divorce in the Soviet Union in the 1920s than it is in Canada today. And they legalized abortion decades before the United States, Canada, and Britain. Now, unfortunately, in the years since then, International Working Women's Day has been co-opted by feminists and renamed simply International Women's Day. Now it fights for all women. And it's basically been reduced to an apolitical carnival. This March 8th, this International Working Women's Day, women everywhere are under attack. In the US, the Supreme Court has ripped up the right to abortion. Violence against women is on the rise globally. Here in Canada, where we have a feminist prime minister, femicides are trending upwards. It is high time to put International Working Women's Day back in the hands of working women and bring back the traditions of revolutionary communism to achieve women free from man and both free from capital. If you would like to fight for liberation, freedom, and communism, help us found the Revolutionary Communist Party of Canada. Join us for our founding Congress and be a founding member of the RCP.